to attend a webinar by Dr. Robert Zatorre. Dr. Zatorre is a core investigative team member of our Music4Pain network, and we are thrilled that he has agreed to present to us today all the fantastic knowledge and experience and wisdom and research that he has related to musical pleasure. And so Dr. Zatorre is a cognitive neuroscientist at the Montreal Neurological Institute of McGill University. He currently holds a Canada Research Chair at the Montreal Neurological Institute. And for those of us in the US, and if you don't know, and abroad who don't know what a Canada Research Chair is, it's actually a very prestigious academic position that is funded by the Canadian government. In 2006, Dr. Zatorre became the founding co-director with Isabel Perez of the International Laboratory for Brain, Music and Sound Research, also called BRAMS. And his research focuses on the neural substrates for music cognition using many different methods such as functional and structural MRI, MEG, EEG, and other brain stimulation techniques. He has done extensive research on the mesolimbic reward circuitry, shedding light on the role it plays in mediating musical pleasure. And of course, that has great relevance to understanding how music may affect pain perception, and that's why we invited him to present on his research. Together with his collaborators and students, Dr. Zatorre has published over 300 scientific papers. So we are absolutely thrilled to have you here, Dr. Zatorre. And without further ado, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And thank you for the invitation and for organizing this whole lecture series. And indeed for organizing the whole Music4Pain network. It's such a cool project. I'm very grateful to be included in it. So today what I thought I would do is give you a very broad overview of some of the research we've been doing for, at least 30 years or more, really trying to understand the neural mechanisms that underlie the perception of music, and especially why it gives us pleasure. And I'll touch very briefly at the end on some implications for pain, but mostly it's to give you the sort of basic science view of these mechanisms that I think are essential if we do want to be able to use music in various therapeutic or other settings. And so I want to start actually with a quote from Darwin, because he was very puzzled by music. He couldn't quite understand, what advantage it gave to humans, and so he questioned what it was for in his work. But the quote I want to give you is actually from his own autobiography, where he has a very insightful and kind of poignant idea. He says, "If I had to live my life again, I would have made a rule to listen to some music at least once every week, for perhaps the parts of my brain now atrophied would have been kept active through use." That's a very interesting concept, right? We're talking about 1881. And then he goes on to say that the loss of these tastes, meaning the loss of pleasure from music, is a loss of happiness and may possibly be injurious to the moral character by enfeebling the emotional part of our nature. So he's basically saying that music is essential for emotions and for regulating our emotional nature. And I think that is really a very valuable concept. So our job really is to try to figure out, well, how is it that this happens? Why? Why does music do this, right? Music is a set of sounds. And so how is it that it generates pleasure and emotion? So my answer is going to be in three parts. This is basically the structure of the lecture. First, I'm going to talk about the neural mechanisms underlying music perception, and especially emphasizing the predictive nature of those mechanisms. And that involves the auditory cortex and the circuitry surrounding it. Then the second part will be about the neural mechanisms of pleasure, reward, and emotion, which is the reward system. And I will argue in the third part that it's the interactions between these two systems that are the source of aesthetic pleasure, specifically for music, but possibly for other types of experiences as well. So keep that in mind as we go through the lecture. So basically, it's a tale of these two systems. On the left, you have the auditory system. So the auditory cortex is located in the superior temporal region right here. And from it, all of these connecting fibers take information and transmit it either towards the front of the brain, frontal cortex, or towards the back in the parietal and prefrontal and dorsal parts of the frontal cortex. And then on the right, you have the reward system. I'm showing you a mid-sagittal view of the same hemisphere, but it's been sort of flipped around so you can see the inside. And I'm highlighting the reward structures, and I'll go into much more detail about that later on. So let's take a closer look at some of these auditory cortical loops, the interactions between the auditory system and the rest of the brain. And we can divide them, and I've sort of color-coded them here, into ventral and dorsal systems. So the ventral one, which is the more inferior one, which I've highlighted in red and orange sort of colors, is responsible for many different functions. I won't have time to go into really any of them, but the important thing to think about is that it's a system that accumulates information over time. That's why I call it time independent. It is sensitive to sound that's coming in from the environment, but more importantly, it's sensitive to the relationships between those sounds and is therefore able to notice when relationships are not as expected. And that's a very critical concept because it means that it's not just responding to sound, it's also actively anticipating what the sounds will be. And this is something that is really quite essential for music. Okay, so how do we know this? Well, we can look, for example, at MEG data, magnetoencephalography. And here we have work done by a former student of mine, Mark Schoenwiesner, who had a very simple experiment where you have a sequence of tones, beep, 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 and then every so often there's a tone that's different, a higher pitch, for example. That's called an oddball paradigm, a very standard sort of paradigm. And what you notice is that whenever there is something unexpected, there's this big deflection coming from the auditory regions. That's what's shown in red here. Also, interestingly, there's a deflection in the inferior frontal regions. So what this means is that it's what's called a mismatch response. It means that the brain is sensitive to the short-term statistics. Once it hears beep, 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 it expects another beep immediately after. And if it gets a beep, then it's like, whoa, something's happened, right? And that signal is generated. So that's already at a very low level, right? Just within a matter of seconds, the brain is able to generate these responses that indicate sensitivity to regularity. In a more musical context, there's this interesting work from Barbara Tillman and her group in Lyon. And what they did was look at the brain response to a chord, actually a chord sequence here, depending on different contexts. So if you read music, you will know that this is a D-flat major chord, and it's preceded by an A-flat major chord. And in tonal music, this would be called a 5 chord, and that would be a 1 chord, right? So it's the dominant and the tonic. It's a perfect cadence, it's called in music theory. Now, that's true if you are in the context of a D-flat major structure. But you could also have that ending in an F minor context, which is rather different. And this ending is somewhat less expected, according to music theory. And indeed, when you play these chords in this context, you get a response in the inferior frontal cortex. Compared to when you hear it in the expected context. So this is similar to the previous in the sense that there's a response in this ventral stream to an unexpected event. But here, the unexpected event is based on long-term statistics, that is to say, knowledge that you've accumulated over a lifetime of listening to tonal music, as opposed to the short-term statistics, which we saw in the first experiment. So these are illustrations of the fact that this ventral stream is very important for not only processing sounds, but also the relationships between those sounds and how those relationships are related to what has occurred before, either immediately before or earlier in your listening history. And we know that this system is extremely critical because if there's a disruption of it, we get the phenomenon known as congenital amusia, which is a phenomenon that my colleague Isabel Peretz has studied a lot. And this is essentially tone deafness. These are people who are otherwise perfectly fine cognitively. There's nothing really the matter with them except that their ability to perceive music is highly impaired. And when we look at their cortical structure, as was done by my late colleague Krista Hyde, along with Isabel Peretz, we see a disruption of these very same regions that I just showed you, the anterior portion of the superior temporal cortex and the inferior frontal cortex. And when we look at the white matter, as we did with Philippe Albouy, we looked at it in several different populations here in Montreal and in the UK and in France. We see very similar patterns where there is a disruption in the white matter that interconnects these regions, that is the auditory region, the temporal lobe, and the inferior frontal region. So this ventral stream is absolutely essential for music. If something happens to it so that it doesn't develop normally, your ability to perceive music is very, very seriously impaired. Okay, that's for the ventral stream. What about the dorsal stream? Well, it has a different set of characteristics. It interconnects with the premotor cortex up here in the dorsal part of the brain, and therefore it is very important for things like sensory motor interactions, the ability to create sounds by actions, whether it be music or speech, for example, but also the ability to hear sounds and then imitate them by your actions. It's also very time dependent, unlike the ventral stream, which I said was more time independent. The computations going on in this stream are really going on in real time, which makes sense because you need that if you're going to be acting on the environment, right? If you're going to be engaging the motor system. As just one example of this sort of phenomenon, we can look at the response of this dorsal stream to metrical regularity. So in the previous examples, I was talking about pitch-based changes, right? Like, or harmonies, like in the case of the chords. Here I'm talking about rhythms, which have to do with the time structure. And if I play you this rhythm, oh, I can't play it. Hold on. If I play you this rhythm, how do I do this? I have to get out of the pointer mode. All right, well, never mind. We'll skip that for the moment. So the point is that we have a simple rhythm that I can actually sing for you. Beep, 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 right? That's a very simple metrical rhythm. Nice structure to it. Or I can take those same temporal elements and just do a permutation of them, just randomly mix them around. They're the same elements, exact same durations, but now they're organized in a really weird way that doesn't make sense musically. Beep, 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 beep. That's like a weird rhythm, right? And when we present that weird rhythm, the dorsal part of the brain is what is active, as shown in this experiment by my former student, Joyce Chen, who's now a prof at University of Toronto. We see that the brain is responding to the unexpected elements. That is, the timing of the elements is not where they should be. They don't fall on any kind of a beat structure. So once again, we have sensitivity to structure, in this case, a temporal structure. So I've just given you a very, very sort of whirlwind overview of these different pathways that connect the cortical part of the auditory system with the rest of the brain. We've seen that they enable various kinds of processes related to encoding different kinds of features. I didn't mention working memory, but that's also a big part of it. If you're accumulating sounds that are happening in real time in your environment, that's involving working memory, because sounds disappear from the environment, right? As soon as you hear a melody, each tone only occurs for a moment and then it's gone. So the brain needs to encode that. And I've emphasized the idea that these systems are sensitive to regularities, which means that they're able to generate predictions about what's coming up. Now, you're wondering, what does this all have to do with pleasure? Because the lecture is really supposed to be about pleasure. And so here we're going to move to the other system that I mentioned at the very beginning, which is the reward system. Now, the reward system is a really very complex system. I'm going to really sort of oversimplify it for you. On the left, you see sort of a wiring diagram from Haber and Knudsen. It's an anatomical wiring diagram indicating the central role of the striatum. The striatum is this structure that you see in the rainbow color here, located deep in the brain. So unlike the cortex, which I was talking about earlier, these are deep gray matter nuclei, part of the basal ganglia actually, that are located very deep in the brain. And the striatum is one of the key structures in the reward system, but there are many other structures that are involved, including the ventral tegmental area, which is down here in the brainstem, as well as the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, the orbitofrontal cortex, the amygdala, the anterior cingulate, etc. So it's quite a complex system. I'm really going to focus on the striatum and talk about especially the division between the dorsal and the ventral striatum for reasons that will become apparent shortly. There has been a great deal of work on the reward system starting in the 1950s, and scientists have been able to document the importance of this system for many different kinds of processes, not only reward, but also motivational kinds of processes, hedonic aspects like pleasure, the idea of seeking of reward, action, the idea of curiosity, which is part of seeking. All of these things are somehow linked in one way or another to different components of the reward system. And one interesting finding is due to Wolfram Schultz, a neurophysiologist, who was one of the first people to suggest this idea of reward prediction error. So what that means is that the reward system, of course, it responds to a primary reward. So for example, if you give a hungry animal food, its reward system will respond to that food. But interestingly, once it knows that the food is coming, it will respond much more if it receives greater amount of food than expected, and it will respond a lot less if it receives a lot less food than expected. And that's what's shown in this panel over here. The first response here is to a cue. So for example, a light that goes on, and the response to that cue is greater and greater as the probability of receiving the reward is greater. And so you notice that the actual reward response is not so great as the cue response because it's really an anticipation. So the reward system is basically predicting what's going to happen and then evaluating that outcome. And if it's better than it was expected, then you get a strong response. And if it was less than expected, you would actually get an inhibition. It's also been shown that these mechanisms, these neurons that I'm showing you here, are actually dopamine neurons, and that the dopamine innervation comes from these brainstem nuclei, the ventral tegmental system and the substantia nigra. This, by the way, is part of the system that's very much impaired in Parkinson's, for example, which is why in Parkinson's you have a decrease in dopaminergic response within the reward system. There's also evidence that it's not only dopamine, but possibly opioids that are involved. There are neurons within the striatum that are opioidergic in nature, not only dopaminergic. And there's a debate about whether they are responsible for the hedonic aspects of reward or not. And we'll come back to this point in a little bit. So the vast majority of what we know about reward actually comes from these animal studies that use primary rewards. So typically with a rodent or a monkey, and you give it money, you give it food or you give it water, but you don't give it money. That's kind of the point. But so what do we know about humans? Well, we do see that very similar things can happen with humans. So this is with functional imaging. If you do give humans money, so these are experiments where people do like gambling games or something like that. When they receive the payout, you see a response in the striatum as well as the ventromedial prefrontal cortex over here. Similarly with food, you get a very similar response. And people have done experiments where participants are shown erotic images. And when they see those images, their reward system is also active. And when you look across these three very different kinds of stimuli or tasks, monetary tasks, food, or erotic images, you see a common response. So this means that there is a commonality between what we see in the animal literature and what we see in humans to these very basic rewards, things like food or sex, which are, pretty central to our survival. You also see them for money, which is interesting because money is a little bit more abstract. But when we first started doing this research over 25 years ago now, we wondered, could music engage the same mechanisms? Music gives us pleasure, yes, but it is not essential for survival the way food is. It's not essential for reproduction the way sex is. And it's not like money. You don't exchange music, to obtain something else, right? You listen to it for pleasure. So we really didn't know if music would be would be dependent on this same mechanism or not. I just need to emphasize that because nowadays, everyone sort of takes it for granted. But I can assure you that when we first started doing this work, we could not take it for granted. But indeed, we were able to do a whole lot of different studies where we could very consistently observe responses in the striatum to highly pleasurable music. This was work done with my former postdoctoral fellow, Anne Blood, who is now a researcher at Harvard. So she was the first in actually 25 years ago now to show that using this sort of low resolution PET method that would get a response to the striatum when people listen to music that they find highly pleasurable as compared to music that other people find pleasurable but they don't. We then showed that this response is in fact dopaminergic in nature using a different kind of imaging technology. This is still positron emission tomography, but now we are using as a tracer raclopride, which is a synthetic molecule that binds to dopamine receptors. And we're labeling it with carbon-11, which is a positron emitter. And so the image that you get here represents dopamine binding potential. So this means that the response we saw here, which is sort of chemically nonspecific, is indeed dopaminergic in nature. That was kind of a big finding that was work done by my former student, Valerie Salampour. And then we also replicated the same finding once again using fMRI. And one thing that we did was compare the response with PET and fMRI, and we were able to show, when you kind of look at both of them together, that the dorsal and the ventral striatum actually have different time courses. So the dorsal one is more involved in the anticipation of the reward. So prior to the peak pleasure, you're anticipating, right? You know what's coming and you're making a prediction about it. And the dorsal part of your reward system is active. And then when you actually experience the pleasure, the most hedonic part, then the ventral striatum is the one that shows a big peak. And so this is important because it shows us a distinction between those two systems, which I'll also come back to momentarily. I also want to tell you about this study because it has a very important finding to it. So in this study, we used a different paradigm. In the first two studies, we just asked people to bring in their favorite music, and they just listened to it in the scanner. In this study, we gave people a variety of different pieces of music, as shown here. This is again done by Valerie Salampour. And so Valerie chose 30 seconds of music that was unfamiliar to the participants, but that they might have reason to like. So we sort of selected, a genre that would be likely to be popular, and we presented up to 70 different musical excerpts while people were in the scanner. And then each person was supposed to say, well, how much money would you give to be able to buy a recording of that piece of music? And then we used the money as an index of the value, and we then regressed it on the brain data. So for each person and for each piece of music, we have a unique number, which tells us how much did that person like each excerpt. So subject one, didn't like music one, slightly liked music two, really liked music number 70, whereas, subject three had a different profile. And so this allows us to tease apart individual preferences, right? And also means that we're using novel music so that we get away from any memory-related issues, because that's also a potential issue of using familiar melodies, is that people are highly familiar with them, obviously, by definition. And so the finding that I've shown you is related to the amount of money spent. So the more money you spend, the more activity there is in the ventral striatum. But the most important finding is that increase is also related to an increase in the relationship between the ventral striatum and the auditory cortex. So here we're measuring not only the activity, but the correlation in the time course of the activity. So if the activity goes up and down in the same way, you get a strong value. If the activity is kind of random, then you get a zero value. And what we see is that the more you like it, the more you like the music, not only is the response of the reward system greater, but also its interaction with the auditory system is greater. And the reason that's important is because it links together these two systems that I've been talking about. It links together the auditory system and its connections with the reward system. So our kind of theory is that the auditory system is involved in generating these sensory prediction errors. That is, it's looking for deviance from what is expected. If you get a deviant response, that is then propagated to the reward system, which generates a reward prediction error. This is telling you how much do you like it or not like it. This is how much is what I heard, what I expected, or what I didn't expect. And this is how good is it? Is it really good or is it not so good? That in turn leads to pleasure and emotional arousal, which in turn also leads to learning, which we won't really be talking about. So this is kind of the core concept that we have been able to develop from our research, and it's kind of the basis for everything else that I'm going to talk about in the second half of the lecture. There's an additional nuance to this model, which is that the dorsal and ventral connections refer to different aspects of these predictions. So the ventral one is more based on patterns. And as I showed you earlier, when we have, for example, patterns of pitches or chords, harmonies, we get responses over here, and that's linked to the ventral striatum, which is more, I might call it a more affective part of the reward system, has a lot to do with evaluations, also the ventromedial portion here, which has to do with assigning value. Whereas the temporal predictions are more dependent on this ventral stream. I emphasized how this system is more time dependent. And so it makes sense that it's more linked to anticipatory or temporal responses. Remember that the dorsal striatum is active when you're anticipating the reward that's coming up. It's basically generating a response that says, oh, well, we know something really good is coming, right? And it's more cognitive in the sense that it's more connected to the prefrontal cortex, cingulate gyrus, and other structures that have to do with more complex cognition, including things like prediction, anticipation, modeling of events, etc. Okay, so we have this model, and what they teach you in high school science class, right, is that if you have a theory, it's supposed to be testable, and you should be able to test it by running experiments. So that's kind of what we're trying to do, very sort of straightforward Popperian kind of science. So one consequence that arises from this idea that the interaction between these systems is responsible for musical pleasure, if that's true, then a loss of musical pleasure should be associated with a disruption of the system, right? That's a straightforward consequence of adopting this model. So how do we test it? Well, we can actually find people who don't experience musical pleasure. And this was work done by Ernest Mas Herrero, a former postdoc of mine who's now back in Barcelona, starting his own lab at the university there. And way back in the early 2010s, we did a bunch of research where we identified people who really they just don't like music. They have no problem with everything else. They like food as much as anyone. They like money. They like sex. They like to exercise. They're young people. They take all kinds of drugs. Um, it's just music that doesn't grab them. And so we call this specific musical anhedonia. And of course, you might say, well, who knows what these people are doing? They're just telling you this on a questionnaire. Is that really meaningful? But we can actually test their physiology. So we play music for them, and we measure responses with skin conductance and with heart rate. And sure enough, the people with this musical anhedonia, lack of pleasure, they just don't respond to music physiologically compared to the average people. And also, we found people who are what we call hyperhedonic. These are people who, love music over everything else. Probably many of us in this research field, and those of you listening into this talk are probably in this category. And these people tend to respond even more to music than the average. And the same is true for heart rate, right? When people with anhedonia, musical anhedonia, listen to music, their heart doesn't do anything. They're flat. Importantly, they do respond to other things. Like I mentioned here, that they have a normal response to money. And when we give them like a gambling task, they, find it kind of addictive like everybody else does. And indeed, when we put them in a brain scanner and we give them the two tasks, a monetary task shown in the striped columns and a music task shown in the solid columns, the people with musical anhedonia show a normal response in the striatum, right and left, to the money task, but not to the music task. In fact, they're inhibited by the music task. It actually turns their reward system off compared to the other two groups who respond positively to both the gambling task and to the music task. So what they're telling us is really true, right? Their brain really is not responding to music, that is. Now, remember that our model is not just about the response of the reward system, but it's about the interaction between the reward system and the auditory system, right? It's about the link between these two systems. We can measure that link using functional connectivity, which is the same type of correlation that I mentioned before. And sure enough, when we look at this region here, shown in blue, the auditory region, and the ventral striatum, we see that the people with musical anhedonia have basically no interaction, or actually it's a little negative, while listening to music between these two systems, compared to average folks who have a small interaction, and the hyperhedonic people like you and me, who are crazy about music, and when we listen to it, these two systems in our brains are very, very strongly linked. We also find some anatomical links, by the way. I don't have too much time to tell you about it, but this red fiber tract here interconnects parts of the auditory and parts of the reward system. And when we look at that in people with musical anhedonia, they tend to have a disorganization. If you look at the diffusivity measures, the white matter, the axons between these two systems tend to be less well organized than that of people with average responses. So we can kind of give ourselves a check mark for that. But so we were very happy with this, but of course reviewers were like, yeah, but you didn't actually show that it's causal because you're just showing a correlation. People who have musical anhedonia have this sort of a thing in the brain, but it doesn't show that one causes the other. So how do we go about showing causal evidence? Well, we can use brain stimulation for this. And luckily, some colleagues of mine way back in the early 2000s had shown that if you stimulate the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, you can get dopamine release in the striatum. That's because of the connections that I showed you earlier in that diagram that showed the connections between the striatum and the rest of the brain. There's a big input from the dorsolateral frontal cortex to the dorsal part of the striatum. And so we can use transcranial magnetic stimulation, which is something that you can apply to the outside of the brain. You put a coil up on the top of your head, and it influences the striatum via those connections that I mentioned. And so we can actually either inhibit or excite the deep structure by stimulating on the outer surface, right through the skull, which is why it's called transcranial. So it's fairly non-invasive. When we do this with the excitatory and inhibitory stimulation protocols, we see that indeed, when people are stimulated in this region, their liking rates go up or down to the music depending on what the stimulation was. By the way, they didn't know which was which, right? They were just stimulated on 2 different days with the two types of stimulation, but it affects their liking rate. It affects their skin conductance. This you can't really fake this, by the way, right? And it affects their monetary bids. In other words, how much money do you want to spend? When they've been stimulated with the excitatory protocol, they want to spend more money. With the inhibitory, they want to spend less money. So we thought this was pretty cool. But again, the reviewers were like, yeah, but haven't you heard there's a replication crisis? And we only tested, I think, 22 people in here, and maybe this won't replicate, and yada, yada, yada. So we did the whole experiment all over again with a whole new set of people, a whole new set of musical stimuli, and we get the exact same thing all over again. So it's really a very consistent response. But in addition, we actually put people in the scanner this time. So the first study was purely behavioral. This one is also behavioral, so we show the same thing. But when we look at the connectivity, the functional connectivity between the auditory region and the striatum, we see that there's a correlation between the degree of connectivity and the change in liking induced by the stimulation. So the better the stimulation was for you, if the stimulation changed your brain a lot, specifically in terms of this connectivity, then you had a larger change in liking. And for those people for whom the stimulation didn't do very much, it's because, for whatever reason, it did not actually change the connectivity. So there's a nice link here between the behavior and the brain response. So we give ourselves a nice check mark for that. Now I want to take a brief hiatus here because I think it's really relevant for the pain story, because there's a different way to causally stimulate the striatum. So this is kind of a kindler, gentler way than putting a coil on your head and, zapping your brain. This is just using neurofeedback. And it's a technique developed by my former postdoc, Naomi Singer, who's now working at Tel Aviv University. And what Naomi did was, I won't go into the details because we're going to run out of time, but she developed an EEG-based algorithm that picks up the activity of the ventral striatum from fMRI, which means that you can now track the activity of the brain just using EEG. So this is a much easier way to do it. And we validated this using cross-validation, and also with a different group of subjects, we can basically demonstrate that the activity coming from the EEG can be predictive of what's going on in the fMRI. So you can see the striatum here and here. So that's our model. And then we apply it in a neurofeedback context. So what this means is basically that people are taught to learn to upregulate their reward system. And here's how we do it. They listen to music. At the same time, with EEG, we look at the pattern of activity, which tells us how much their reward system is active. We feed that activity into an algorithm that changes the music that they're hearing to make it sound better if the reward system is more active, and makes the music sound worse, more distorted, if the reward system is not active. And then we feed that music back to them. So it's a closed loop neurofeedback system. You listen to music, your reward system is active to a certain extent or not. The degree to which it's active makes the music sound better or not. The degree to which the music sounds better, in turn, makes the reward system more active, right? And so you learn to do this over time. We taught them over 6 different sessions over a 2-week period. And the bottom line is that people learn to do this. So we had a sham group in orange and the stimulation active feedback group in blue. You see over time, they learn to upregulate their reward system. And when we test them with fMRI before and after, we see that what they've learned to do is to enhance the connectivity between these two systems. The people who had this neurofeedback training basically learned how to increase this link, which I've shown you is critical to the music reward experience, right? So I think this is sort of interesting because it could be a way to enhance the reward responsivity and maybe allow better pain control. Who knows? Okay, back to this. I only have like 5 minutes left. I just want to tell you about 2 last studies, which I think are very relevant also for the pain question. I emphasized earlier the role of the dopaminergic system in all of this, but we don't have causal evidence for the role of dopamine. All I was able to show you is that when pleasurable music is experienced, that dopamine is released in our brain imaging experiments. Dopamine is released in the striatum. It doesn't mean that dopamine is necessary, just that it's released, right? Maybe it's not necessary, it's just released, but it's not causing the experience. So how do we test this? Well, one way to test it is using a pharmacological manipulation. And I was very, very fortunate to work with my colleague Laura Ferreri and Ernest Macerero and a bunch of other colleagues at the famous Hospital de la Santa Creu y Sant Pau in Barcelona. This is, by the way, a UNESCO World Heritage Site. If you're ever in Barcelona, you probably will go to the Sagrada Familia because everyone goes there. But I invite you to just go behind the cathedral and go up Avenida Gaudí, which takes you straight to this former hospital, which is a magnificent building. It's an architectural wonder. And in addition, they have a whole lot of very knowledgeable people who do very complicated pharmacological experiments. And they were already doing this experiment, so we sort of piggybacked onto it, and we just gave them music on top of everything. The experiment involved healthy participants who receive either placebo or risperidone, which is a dopamine receptor antagonist, or levodopa, which is a dopamine precursor, which is, of course, often given in Parkinson's. And then we gave them our usual music task. And what we see is that people do respond differently. So if we give them levodopa, which enhances their dopamine responsivity, we see a greater number of chills responses than when they receive risperidone, which inhibits dopamine responses. Similarly, electrodermal activity shows the same pattern. This is skin conductance, and the monetary task shows essentially the same pattern. Physiologically, we also see the same thing. When you give people levodopa, they have a stronger response in the skin conductance. So this means that yes, we think that this is pretty strong causal evidence that if you deprive people of dopamine, you won't get the response. Whereas if you give them extra dopamine, they'll give a stronger response. Well, what about opioids? Because there is evidence that opioids are also involved in many different aspects of reward, particularly in the hedonic aspects of reward. So we did a very similar experiment using two different pharmacological agents. My timer is going off here. Naltrexone and oxycodone, one of which is inhibiting, one of which is exciting the opioid system, and we see no modulation whatsoever. This is placebo in the middle. So real-time pleasure ratings, the number of chills, liking, emotional arousal ratings, emotional valence ratings, money spent, there's absolutely no effect. So the opioid system does not seem to mediate the cognitive aspects of music in the sense of the experience of it, right? The hedonic experience. However, it does modulate the psychophysiological response. This is the skin conductance response. And you see that when you get the oxycodone, you have a much stronger response than when you get the naltrexone to music, as well as to a control monetary task. So this is interesting because it means there's a dissociation between these two systems. And I don't think we understand what's going on here yet. We'll have to see what's going on. But it means that the opioids are not functioning in the same way as dopamine. Dopamine is essential for both the experiential aspect and the physiological aspect. Opioids may be involved in the physiology, but that might have implications for pain as well. I don't know. But it doesn't seem to be involved in the hedonic aspect. So I'm just going to mention as a teaser that we are doing experiments in pain with my colleague Mathieu Roy, who's on the right here, and his student Elise Debarras. They've done some really beautiful studies showing that music reduces pain. This is a thermal pain applied to the forearm. You get strong reductions to music compared to like scrambled music. And really interestingly, they've recently shown, this is like a slide I got from Elise, day before yesterday, so it's very, very recent findings. They find that whether you are getting pain or music or scrambled music or no music, and then the influence on pain ratings of that condition is fully mediated by how much pleasure you experience to the music. So statistically, listening to music doesn't affect pain ratings except insofar as the music is pleasurable. It's strictly the pleasure you derive from music that affects pain ratings. And really, as a real teaser, they are finding some responses in the ventromedial prefrontal cortex. So that's really exciting. We'll see where that goes. So final take-home message is that music really is this thing that we've developed, right? Humans have figured it out. Humans have kind of hacked into their own brains. And music is a way that we have learned to use to enhance our emotional arousal or to regulate our arousal, but also that of others. And it's all due to the interaction of these two systems. The dopaminergic system, which has to do with reward valuation, which, by the way, is a phylogenetically very ancient system. This is a system we share with other primates and with rodents and et cetera. But this is a very highly developed system in humans, the ability to predict outcomes, to understand patterns of sounds, anticipate what's going to happen. those are amongst the most cognitively advanced mechanisms that we have. So music kind of depends on both things, a very primal system that has to do with survival, and a very cognitive, intellectual system that has to do with understanding patterns of abstract sounds. I want to be sure to thank all of my colleagues, whom I've mentioned, I think most of them throughout the talk, the different funding agencies. If you wish to learn more, please get my book, which really details everything that I've told you today. It's published by Oxford University Press. You can order it from them, or you can get it from Amazon. And I mentioned that Elise and Mathieu will be talking in this series sometime in March or April. So stay tuned for that. I think it will be very interesting to see how they're applying some of this knowledge about music and reward directly to studies of pain. And just to remind you, next week's seminar by Dr. Wang, which is specifically about analgesia in osteoarthritis. So thank you very much. I'm sorry I've gone over a little bit in the
That's
time.
okay. That's okay. Thank you so much for the excellent presentation.
Very happy to take any questions you might have.
Yes. People actually have some wonderful questions, and before we go to them, I want to clarify that Dr. Wang's webinar is next month, not next week, I believe, unless I'm wrong. But go to our, they're all announced on our website, so you can find the information there. We have several really interesting questions. I'm not sure if we'll get to all of them, but the first one I'll pose to you is somebody who's asking whether musical pleasure can be diminished when intellectual analysis is engaged. And this is from somebody who was a musician, or before they were a professional musicians, really enjoyed listening to music. The more they played professionally, the less they started enjoying music. They stopped listening to music because they could no longer enjoy or experience it in the same way, since I was constantly analyzing the music and so on. After a few years after they gave up their professional musician career, they learned to love music again. So the question is, could over-analyzing music, diminish pleasure?
It's an interesting question. I think based on my model, I would have to say no, because my whole model depends on the idea that you have a cortical system that is indeed analyzing the sound patterns, right? And we know that if you disconnect that analysis system from the reward system, you get musical anhedonia. So if you're unable to analyze the patterns, if you're unable to understand the relationships between sounds as they're evolving during a musical piece, music becomes meaningless to you and you don't experience the pleasure. So I think I would have to say no. And I think conversely, there's also a lot of evidence that the more you know about music, the more you enjoy it. And the reason for that is because the more you know about music, the better able you are to make those predictions, right? So if I listen to, I don't know, John Coltrane, I'm barely getting 2% of it. I know that. It's so complex. I know there's a lot going on there. I don't have the knowledge, the capacity, the exposure, the training to understand it, right? So I'm missing out. A lot of it sounds really just weird and it's hard to listen. Whereas I was trained as an organist, so when I listen to a complicated Bach fugue, I know all about it. I can play it and I know it. So I understand exactly what's going on. Someone who's like a super jazz aficionado would have the exact opposite um, uh, response, right? They know what Coltrane is doing, or at least some of it, and they can better make those predictions. And so they get what's happening. And when Coltrane changes something that you don't expect, introduces a new chord or something, they go, yeah, I know what's going on. So, I mean, that's my answer, which I don't negate the individual's personal experience. Maybe there's other reasons for that. I don't know, but I would stick with my answer.
Another interesting question is, can musical anhedonia be an acquired condition? For example, for adults who have substance use disorder, could the overuse of one pleasurable substance replace the pleasure they get from music?
Hmm.
I am a music therapist with adults who have complex and long-term substance use disorders and seem to show either musical hyperhedonia or anhedonia.
Yeah, that's interesting. So the short answer is I don't know. Um, the people that we've studied are what we call congenital musical anhedonics. When we interview them, they say, "No, I've been like this all my life. I never liked music when I was a kid. When I was in school, they made me sing or whatever. I didn't like it. When I was a teenager, all my friends were listening to music, and I was like, nah, I'd rather go do something else." Um, but it's interesting that in people with substance abuse, you have these strange responses to music. I think that does make sense because basically people with substance use disorders have a complete dysregulation of their reward system. And so if that whole system is not properly regulated, um, anything could happen, right? You might have over responses or under responses or who knows what. I do think this bears a lot more investigation. I think it would be very, very interesting to see how that happens. Um, and the neurofeedback idea that I mentioned earlier, my colleagues are working on applying that to different kinds of disorders of dysregulation of the reward system, including addiction. The idea being that if you use music and you learn how to use the music as a way to, you know, kind of dampen down the overactivity, it might give you a handle on uh, on how you're responding to other stimuli.
Okay. Here's another one. Do we know what explains the benefits of music in unconscious patients?
Hmm. Yeah, very interesting. We don't, and I think that is definitely something that needs to be studied. And in fact, I have a project with some colleagues who are studying minimally conscious states. It's really not clear how much of the sound is transmitted um, to those patients. In other words, how much is being processed is really not known, and I think it probably varies a great deal from individual to individual, depending on the exact nature of the brain damage that they've sustained, depending on the exact state of minimal consciousness, and there are many different gradations of that. So I think it's a fascinating question. I think there are probably therapeutic implications for that. There are, there's been research, for example, on locked-in patients who actually have quite a lot of sensory processing, even though they don't have almost any ability to respond. So in those patients, it might be far more beneficial than in the ones whose sensory systems are completely cut off. But yeah, super, super interesting area that I think I have the feeling that people are now turning to that. It's one of the great things about this research area is that is when I started doing it, it was kind of esoteric, to be honest. Like people were like, "What? You're studying music? What's that about?" And now what we see is that, there's all these interesting potential applications and people really, devoting themselves to it. It's extremely rewarding to see, how that's coming along.
I want to be respectful of your time. Do you have time for
It's
one or
okay. I
two
have
more
time.
questions? Yes,
I have
I
time.
know that people may need to leave. Please know that all of our webinars are recorded, so the answers to these last few questions will be available on our website within the next few days. Um, the next question is, independently, music and social connections can activate reward centers. Is there any evidence that bringing together people through music heightens the reward center response even more than when they're listening to music alone?
Yes, I think there is such evidence. I'm not an expert on the social aspects of music, but there is a great deal of evidence that group activities um, tend to generate much more of a rewarding experience. We know there are many examples of this, everything from, choirs singing to children playing together or singing together or jumping up and down together or what have you. Um, and as the questioner notes, it's really interesting that there is a well-established theory of social reward, and it is also well known that that goes through the same reward system. I mean, basically, the reward system, takes inputs from many, many different uh, um, parts of the brain. It's the final common pathway for the experience of reward. And social cognition is no different. Whatever parts of your brain are mediating social cognition, when we experience a rewarding social experience, whether it be friendship or, child-parent interaction or sexual interactions, um, these are all mediated through the reward system. So it makes sense that insofar as music also engages that same system, that the two together would potentiate each other.
Mm-hmm. Somebody is asking, most of the studies that you presented are based on music listening experiences, and if you could comment or if there's any research happening on active music making, and if that research is happening in your lab as well or not.
Yeah. So the observation is correct. We've done almost all our work on perception. We have done a lot of research on music production, but not in the context of reward, rather in the context of sensory motor interactions. And we have gone so far as to work with some engineers to build us the world's only MRI compatible cello. So we actually have a device that we can put in the scanner and that you can actually play lying on your back, which is a strange looking thing. Um, so we're very interested in music performance, um, but mostly, like I said, we've looked at it in terms of that dorsal stream, the connection between um, the motor system and the perceptual system. I think it's an interesting question as to whether the reward system is more engaged or less engaged, depending on your active playing. It sort of gets back to the first question about the person who said that when they were playing music, they were too too focused on the playing to enjoy it. So I think there's a lot more to learn uh, about that because the majority of people who play music describe it as a pleasurable experience, except that there are other things going on, particularly in professionals where there are things like, performance anxiety, um, or, having been a musician in training at one point in my life, there's always you're going to meet your teacher and you didn't really practice, and he's going to be very grumpy because you didn't improve that one passage that you were supposed to work on. So there are other things going on that might impede your pleasure, but by and large, a lot of people, play music, quote, for pleasure, right? That's like a thing that people say. So I think that I don't think it is the case that playing music is less pleasurable overall than listening to music. I think both can be pleasurable, but I don't think we know enough to be able to understand exactly, how that plays out. Like under what circumstances might it be less or more pleasurable?
Maybe one final, there's many more questions, but I guess people will have to read your book to get all of their
Exactly.
questions answered. But final question, would it be accurate to say that the more predictable a person finds a piece of music, the more rewarding and probably dopamine producing the experience will be?
That's a very good question, and the answer is no, not exactly.
Mm-hmm.
So, and this I do cover in the book a lot. Um, there's a well-known so-called inverted U-shape function that relates musical pleasure to degree of predictability. So we have done experiments, and many other labs have as well, where you vary the degree of complexity, that is how predictable something is. So if you take a very, very simple tune, like a nursery rhyme or something, right? It's very predictable, it's very repetitive. Da 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 da, right? It's like, okay, super simple. Um, and then you can make it more and more complex, and there are ways to measure that. People have developed statistical models of how predictable something is. And then at the very extreme, you have some, very avant-garde sort of music where it's highly unpredictable. And what you find is this inverted U shape. So people really prefer a medium level. So if it's too predictable, what happens is that your reward system shuts off because remember I talked about reward prediction error, which is the difference between what's expected and what occurs. So if what you expect is exactly what occurs, it's boring, right? Nothing's happening. On the other extreme, if it's super chaotic, you cannot make any predictions. So therefore, it's also boring because you can't really evaluate whether what has just happened is interesting or not because you couldn't predict it anyway because it was so random. And there's a real sweet spot, which is hard to obtain, by the way, which is why, like, creating great music is not trivial, um, because you have to get the balance just right. You have to get just enough predictability and just enough surprise. You have to have enough predictability so that you can make the predictions, and you have to have enough surprise so that some of those predictions are going to be met with something better than what you were expecting. And that's kind of the key. And that inverted U-shaped function, by the way, has been described in the reward literature a lot under many different circumstances. It's not just for music. It applies to almost every reward system. If you're gambling, for example, right? If you get a payout every time, it sounds good, but that actually becomes boring. And if you never get a reward, then you also shut off. Um, and this has been applied to other things like in aesthetics research, movies or novels or poetry. Like, there's always this idea that you have to be able to have a structure that you can understand, and then the artist or the musician, the writer, the performer is going to introduce novel elements to keep your interest up.
Mhm. Well, with that, I want to thank you for a wonderful presentation in the chat. Many, many people have been thanking you for a wonderful learning experience. Again, people, this will be posted on our website if you want to look back at it. And our next webinars are also posted on our website. The next one will be with Dr. Wang talking about, let me actually get the right time here, or the right date. That will be on February 12th at 11 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, looking at the role of cortical alpha dynamics underlying emotional music induced analgesia in people with knee osteoarthritis. And then, as Dr. Zatorre mentioned, Elise Desbaratsen from Dr. Mathieu Roy's lab will, in end of March, beginning of April, also do a webinar on kind of building on what Dr. Zatorre actually presented here today. So thank you so much for joining us all. And Dr. Zatorre, thank you again for giving us this wonderful learning experience.
Thank you, and thank you to everyone who sat through it. And I'd be happy to, if someone has questions, they can always write to me.
Thank you so much.
Okay,
Bye-bye.
bye-bye.